Today we're talking about,
thank you, Karen,
how to work with a service provider in an individualized living arrangement. What can we look for in a provider? How can we work as partners? What's their job, this job of the service provider? What's the things that we might like to be in charge of? And how can we create an agreement that spells this out? So today we're joined by Margaret Ward, Leanne Pearman, and Jo Nunn is going to be talking about her son, Dad. Now, unfortunately, Jo couldn't join us tonight, but we did have an opportunity to record Jo talking about her son, Dan, and his individualized living arrangement and how they work with a provider. So you'll hear a little bit from Jo in a little while, but I'll start off with Jo. Jo would describe herself first and foremost as the mother of two sons, one being Dan, who has a disability. Alongside Dan's microboard, Jo focuses on supporting Dan to live his life in his own home and live his life in ways that are meaningful for him. They have a shared management agreement with a service provider. They work together to ensure that Dan has genuine choice and control over his life. We're also joined by Margaret Ward. Margaret raised her daughter Mina, who has multiple disabilities, to believe that she could have a life like her brother and sister. Her short life, sadly, Mina died at age 30. In her short life, though, she went to regular school. She worked in open employment and lived in a home of her own for 11 years. She showed others what is possible with a strong, positive vision for a good life and family willing to break the traditions of services, I suppose, or the way things were. Mina's legacy lives on through the many people with disability and families who met her and saw what was possible. And as part of that legacy, Margaret has done extensive work on what is the right relationship to be working with service providers. Margaret developed a resource called 7 Steps to Self-Direction that with us at Resourcing Inclusive Communities. And it's the most useful resource in thinking about working in the right relationship to build good lives for people with a disability. Thanks for joining us, Margaret. And Leanne Pearman is CEO of WA Individualised Services and the Australian Inclusion Group. She's been involved in the lives of people with a disability and families for more than 30 years, and this has enabled her to develop a deep understanding and commitment to people, citizenship, and the importance of community. Leanne provides practical advice, mentoring, and support, building the capacity of people with disabilities and families, particularly around individualised services, and has worked with people with disabilities, families, and service providers on what it takes to work in partnership. Welcome, Leanne, and thank you, both of you, for joining us in this conversation today about working well with providers. I'm going to stop sharing my slides and I'm going to start asking some questions. Oops, but when I did that, I lost my questions. Whoops, I've still lost my questions. Margaret, I'm just going to start by just knowing that the question I want to ask is, can you tell us a little bit about Mina and how she lived her life in her own home?
Thank you, Linda. Mina was born in 1979, so perhaps had she been able to live, she would be older than some of you here. She was a very strong character given her quite significant disability. She wanted to leave home at 19. She gave me the date. And that was in 1998. That's right. So the NDIS wasn't even a twinkle in the eye of government at that point. We didn't have enough money, and so we had to be very creative about how that happened. And also the services were seriously not interested in individualization or working closely with families at that time, the major services. So we were behind the 8 ball. Nonetheless, Mina was determined and we did it. She lived in her home for 11 years, dying in 2009. So yes, so there were some lessons there. And while I don't have a good working knowledge of the NDIS, I think there's a message for everyone here that the NDIS can only make this easier for you. I am convinced on that. Okay, do you want any more on Mina?
Yeah. Well, I think there was some really there's a book written by Jeremy, your late husband,
Yes.
called They Shouted Goodbye. We've shared that recently. Do you want to just talk about some of the clever ways that you, without funding, made it work?
We had to cobble together paid support, informal support, the capacity of friends visiting, which was somehow not really support, but just community inclusion, into I guess, a jigsaw puzzle of a good life for Mina. So one of the tricks we used, dare I say a trick, but it was an idea that was actually given to us by our service provider, to invite people to dinner every night, nearly every night. Mina was an extrovert, can I say? So I don't think I could have coped, but she loved it. So people came from all walks of life in her life for 2 hours from 7 till 9. And a dinner was cooked beforehand for them. And they stayed till the 9 o'clock overnight person came. Now, there wasn't a lot of support required, just someone with Mina having a meal, a glass of wine was great fun. Sometimes they didn't eat the meal and went round the corner to the pokies, and sometimes they called a cab. We had a rule that dinner guests were always right, whatever they did. And if a worker had thought they'd put a lot of effort into a meal and it wasn't eaten, then that's okay. They were just being wild and getting on with spontaneous life. So that was one way. The family did do sleepovers, not all the time, but it was actually quite helpful just to keep an eye on what was happening in the household. We also had people sharing with her from 2002 to 2005. We had 2 people, one after the other, who were not asked to do anything particular except to be in the house from 9 at night till 7 in the morning, 4 nights a week. Now, they stayed longer than that, clearly, but they also, because they were housemates, a lot of spontaneous, nice activities happened with Mina. So that worked very well. And if Mina had not been so ill towards the end of her life, we would have continued that because she enjoyed it enormously. And the people are out there. I'm absolutely convinced on that. They're such joyful young people who are very happy to share with others, particularly when rents are so expensive.
Yeah.
So there were a number of strategies. I guess the key message there was it did require the family to cobble it together, and that wasn't a hugely difficult task. once trust was built with people, people understood the importance of turning up and what their tasks were when they were there, what their roles and responsibilities were. And once that was all in place, it worked very well.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Margaret. I just would like to hear a little bit about your thinking around the right relationship with service providers. I've heard it described as a dance or some choreography even between the person's responsibility or their family's responsibility and the services. And just really would be interested in hearing about your thinking there. And yeah, your thinking there.
This was a notion, I guess, coined or named by Michael Kendrick, and particularly around his work with Homes West, which was the little service that supported Mina. And right relationship just doesn't happen. It's a work in progress. But there are some key features or key givens that should be in place for this to happen. The first is that there's a notion of modesty with the service, that they are willing to work in partnership with families. And I call it modesty because I think a lot of services are not modest. They're pretty proud of themselves. And I think modesty goes a long way. The second is that the services are open to innovation and learning, which follows from modesty, that if you come thinking you don't know everything, then you're open to learning and innovation. The next is that they're small enough in their management or local enough in their management to respond quickly, locally, and creatively to problems. So you're not going up a hierarchy to solve something that on the face of it is quite simple, but by the time an onerous process is performed, it becomes a larger problem than it need be. I think another thing is that the service is expecting to be directed by the person with disability and families, and that is also part of the modesty, that they don't know. They come to learn, and that will take time. So, and hand in hand with that is an understanding that trust is essential, but it takes time to build trust, and particularly for families who have been burnt or have had trust broken. Trust broken takes a very long time to heal, and it's like a knee-jerk reaction that once a service does something wrong, they'll say, oh, they're just like the others. And so it's a delicate business building trust. And I'm the first to say that. I'm pretty harsh about that. But once people learn, once I've began the trust building, a key feature with that is that you're meeting regularly, so that what trust has been built will expand and consolidate. So I think they're the sort of key features of a service that before you even talk about right relationship, they're the key features of a service that's ready for it. Now, so there's I guess with right relationship also is that the families with the person with disability need to step up, and it's time for pulling on your big girl pants and being clear and and doing your homework and being ready to be in partnership. I say that a bit like a school teacher because I find lots of rhetoric around this, and then families are as neglectful in communicating, being untrustworthy, being pompous, and so all those things that I talk about in the service, that I ask of a service, I expect of myself. So, and can I say, I don't think that's too hard when you love your child irrationally and wonderfully, that you want the best for them. This is not hard. It's just bringing it to consciousness that your behavior is as important. Your good behavior is as important as the behavior of a service. So in that, I have given a little handout to Linda about what I call family business and service business. So it's understanding your roles and responsibilities, what families are responsible for and what services are responsible for. Now, this isn't legislation. This is what the families of Homes West came up with. So I suggest you think about your own, and Linda will send this out. But essentially on the left, you have what I think is pretty obviously family business. And that is you have the vision and the plan. You are responsible of ensuring the families and the allies are there now and in the future. That it's the family's responsibility to safeguard the health, well-being and quality of life for the person now and into the future. Your job is the love and the friendship, and deciding where, how, and with whom the person lives, and within the cultural norms of that family. So this may not be explicit, but it may need to be explicit. For instance, you may not like people wearing shoes into your house. Your service isn't going to know that unless you make it very clear what the customs are in your family and the rituals are. And deciding who will support the person ultimately. There may be a process to get, a short list, but in the end, the person with disability with their family will decide who enters into that very personal space of family, of personal support. And safeguarding the person's history, medical and financial information. So deciding what is confidential, what's not confidential, and making sure all that is safeguarded. And planning the person's financial security into the future. Now, we would do this for any of our other children. We'd do this for ourselves. So it sounds like an onerous list, but this is just family business in my mind and in the minds of the Homes West families. So if we flick to the other side of what is service business, then it's about getting to know the person well. They have a service has a responsibility to get to know that person really well. And that's got a lot to do with how you take on that information and train staff and so forth. I won't go into it all now, but there's very clear, or I'll run out of time. But I do need to say in the middle, there is some grey areas for negotiation. There is shared business that, you can work out together. And there's also business that the family can, hand over to a trusted worker. So it's not all all or nothing. There is a grey area in between, and it would be up to you as families to decide what you would hand over. Nonetheless, if you do not do this work, services will do it for you. And that's when you lose control. And that's when the bad things happen. So that's why I'm very adamant about this, that a family needs to be very clear about their family business, have it documented, have it well thought through and safeguarded. So then when you come together, when you approach a service, you can ask for an agreement around, well, one, that to ensure they're going to do the service business, tell them what you're going to do in the family business, and negotiate the middle stuff. And I think that's in Homes West families did this yearly. It was, we sat down with the service provider and worked it out. Now, some older families handed over quite a lot of things to their trusted workers, whereas I, as a younger family member, was much more controlling, can I say? And it's to do with your personality. But if you don't bring it to consciousness, if you don't clarify it, that's when relationships break down and trust breaks down. So this is actually a trust building strategy. So if you sit down and work it out together and sign it at the bottom and revisit it, you're 80% there. So in a sense, I don't think this is hard. I don't think this is impossible. I think it's, and we've heard that services are getting sloppy about this. They will if families do not do this work. It's simple as that. If you do the work and you turn up to the service with the expectations, with a clear understanding of what you want from them, then if they don't respond, then you're out the door. You say bye-bye, see you later, and you go to the next service provider. It'll sort them pretty quickly. Okay, I think, is there any questions about that?
We'll go on because we're going to hear an example from Jo, who, as I said, isn't able to make it today. I'm just going to grab her video and share that. And Jo gives us a bit of an example of shared management. And then we'll come back and have Leanne will share some principles as well. And then we'll come back and have questions. So I can just see there's one comment in the chat about filling gaps in managing planned and unexpected absences of staff can be a shared business too. And again, that's something that you can negotiate with a provider. Just going back and sharing the screen again. And oops, I nearly forgot to do the sound. Where do I do sound? It's not giving me the option for sound.
Linda, it's usually before you come into the actual meeting. It gives you the option at the start or when you go to share it.
Yeah, when you go to share it, it's normally there, and it's not here at the moment. So I'm going to just give it a shot, and if there's no sound, someone yell at me. So fingers crossed. So I just thought to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about Dan and his life? Is that working? And a little bit about how his support is arranged.
Okay, I thought it would be good for us to start back at the beginning because it helps give context for where we are now. And Dan was about 1 when we walked out of the paediatrician's office, and we had learned, he'd gone to great pains to tell us that Dan had a very complex seizure disorder. In fact, some of the seizures were lasting up to 6 hours at a time, and that he had a significant disability. It was so significant that he wouldn't be able to go to school because he was so unwell. And that included a school that would have a dedicated nurse. So over here we call them special education schools. And he said he would not be able to go to school. And the first thing I said to Dan's dad when we walked out to the car park was, what happens when we can't do this anymore? And I guess that really informed the future, my thinking around Dan's future and what would be happening for him once we were not able to do and support him anymore. And so, not that I would have called it a vision back then, because that wasn't really in my vocabulary. It was just his future. What would happen and what would he want for his future? And as time went on, we were figuring out, you know, the things that Dan liked and what he could do, and being a part of learning all of that around him. And this vision for Dan is my vision for him, which I did on the year that he was leaving school, because at that time he didn't have what we termed as a robust communication system. I didn't term it, speech therapists. We've since got one, but we didn't have any form of communication from Dan other than natural language, body language, and so on and so forth. So this became my vision for him. And we really had learnt that we wanted committed people around him who were in his life regularly and knew him well, that he has lots of friends and a full social life, that he has action in his life. Back then, he was quite an action man. He liked abseiling and things like that. It's changed a little bit, but he still likes doing outside stuff. And so we've kept that in there. And that he's continuing to learn in purposeful and practical ways. And I guess, again, I wouldn't have used this terminology when he was younger, but he's a lifelong learner, just like we all are. And, you know, that is an important vision. That he's getting paid well in the work roles that he does, just as much as anybody else who would be doing the same job. And he's doing work that he enjoys and feels really good about. So this one has been achieved. Dan is living in a 4-bedroom home. He has shared his home with a variety of friends over the years, and we're on the lookout for a new housemate. His first 2 friends that he shared with were from school, and one moved away from town, and the other one began working elsewhere. So he had to move away too. I don't know if that's popping up for you there, Linda. That Dan can have the capacity to have complex conversations. He's certainly doing that now. And he'll be financially secure and be supported by a team of people who are paid, but get great job satisfaction from working with Dan, and always with the view that they open up pathways for growth and development for them. And underpinning all of that, Dan will be in control of his own life and making his own decisions. So how was I going to be sure that this could continue well into his future? Way back then, when I had a lot to learn, I didn't know how that could happen, but it was always on the lookout for it. And Dan has a small group of people around him.
Tell us a little bit about how you had, you know, Dan's life and the support arrangement that you have.
Yep, sure.
You said Dan lived in his own home, so that would be pretty cool to know about.
Great, yes. Well, Dan does live in his own home, and that took some figuring out. I don't think I could have done that on my own as a parent. So Dan has a group of people around him who have initially we were looking at a circle of support, but we moved on to learning about microboards. So Dan has a little group of people around him who formed a microboard, and we figured out how to support Dan to move home. Initially, it was into a community housing home. And once he was there for a couple of years, we approached them to see if he could buy it. And we put our heads together and worked out how that could happen. So he does live in his own home. It's about a minute from where I live, and he's supported 24/7, predominantly with paid supporters. We call our supporters mentors. They kind of understood that this was quite different to any of the other support worker roles they'd done previously. And a couple of mentors came to me, gosh, it must be about 15 years ago now, and said, look, we don't think this is a support worker role. It's really quite different to anything that we've ever done before. And they came up with the name Mentor. And from there, we've really done our best to embed the culture of supporting Dan to have his own life. And figured out ways to, I guess, hold the integrity of Dan pursuing the things that he would like to do. Communication's been a big part of that, and getting the team on board with learning Dan's communication and understanding just the very basic principles that you respond, that you be prepared to learn it, that it's always with him because Dan can't pick it up and carry it. He's very clever with how he uses it. So with the vision, Dan having complex conversations, he really does know how. It's the rest of us that tend to fall down in that area and figuring it out because it's quite limited with the communication that he has. But he's been very clever to work all that out.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about then how you've sort of come to sort of, you know, Dan's in his own home and there's some support around him. Tell us a little bit more about how you work that out.
Yeah. The process of living in his home took a number of months. Because I'm not really a rule breaker, when I got the call from the Department of Housing, it actually came 6 years before we were expecting it. That's how long the waiting list was. So it just happened to be the right area. The home came up. My first expression, not to Dan, but to his microboard members is, you know, we can't take this on because I'm not ready. I'm not ready. But actually Dan was very ready. And what the microboard members were able to do was just to hold us while we did this transition and figure out, did Dan want to do this and was he ready and how would we know? So we did a few things. We got the mentors to drive around and take Dan to the house because it was empty and we could do that, talk to him about it and ask questions. But this was going on for a couple of weeks, I think probably going into 3 weeks or so, where Dan wasn't giving us any indication about this house at all. Like we couldn't figure it out. And then one day, one of the mentors who's been with him for 17 years now decided to drive around, just keep driving around. So they go into the driveway and Dan would be sitting there and they'd be talking about the house and then they pull out and then they do a lap around because it's actually around a block. And the mentor would go, do you want to go and look at your house again, Dan? And Dan would nod his head, so they'd go back. And they did this a number of times. And that day they had a friend from school who actually moved in with him in the back. And they, about the 5th time they pulled into the driveway, his mate Reese said, so do you want to move out and move away from your mum or not? And Jenna said, Dan couldn't get the door open fast enough. He opened the door and tried to get out of the car immediately. Dan can't walk, but he was opening the door and saying, yes, let me get out of here. So it was learning the right question. So we then knew that he wanted to move out. And once he was living there for a couple of years, it was a slow process. We were camping on the floor in the lounge room because we didn't have any beds or anything, and it was a big deal to move everything over. So we thought we'd just camp there and see how Dan felt about sleeping overnight. And sometimes he'd just sleep with his friends, sometimes he'd sleep with me, sometimes he'd sleep with paid mentors. But it became really clear that he was pretty keen to move in. So then the job was to figure out how that could happen. We had very limited funding, so we then figured that bit out. And then when he was in full time for a couple of years, our next job was to figure out, did he want to buy the home, have a mortgage like everybody else? And we that took 2 years actually to find out if that's what he wanted to do.
And how does the support, Dan's support work? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, now it works that we have people who are there all the time, paid all the time. We are not, it's not ideal, it's not what we want. We would like to go back to having part paid and, you know, living with a friend or friends. So we're exploring all of that again now. And he has, it's kind of, we do partly with self-managing and partly it's shared management. The organisation are very supportive of that, and they're very supportive of us taking on more of the self-management as we would like to, or, you know, if we need them to do more of the shared management, we can always ask that of them. It's very flexible in how we do that. But the arrangement we have at the moment is working really well. Essentially, we are doing all of the recruitment and the training. We can do that because it's not just me. There's a group of people who are, you know, joining in all of that. The microboard members join us with the recruitment process. And Dan, we figured out, it's taken us a long time, but we figured out how Dan can choose the people that he would like to work with him.
So when you're looking for, you know, if you're going out looking for a service that can work in partnership with you or work in a shared management way, what would be some of the questions you would suggest that we could be asking when we're interviewing perhaps those providers?
Yeah, well, one of the things I did is I created a photo album of all the things that Dan had been doing. Not all the things, some of the things like go-karting, abseiling, all of that kind of stuff. It was very visual and it really helped them to get the essence of who Dan was. And it really, you know, I was able to talk to that and say, this is what we want to continue and this is what we, you know, Dan wants for his life. And how do we do that? I think it wasn't a case of, as I said, over the couple of years of talking to families about their own children, particularly the older kids, I had questions like, you know, would you support someone? Would you support Dan to live with someone? You know, could he have housemates, or are you going to stop that, or, you know, have a problem with that happening? Or will the, you know, if something should happen to me and you were needed to step in and do more of the recruiting and, you know, training, will you retain that information around Dan wanting to live with someone and have a housemate? Back then, I wouldn't have said this, but now I would say he might want to have a girlfriend. He might want to live with a girlfriend. I would include that if I was out looking for an agency now. I would just think about all of the things that you've been doing recently in your son or daughter's life and say, well, we don't want any of this to change, and can you support this? And how would you support it? They're the kinds of things that I would be asking. I would also ask if there was anyone that I might be able to talk to, any families that have been with them for a while, and to check out, you know, if they were up for me visiting. If not, then a cup of tea in a cafe somewhere to talk to the parents or even the person with a disability, if that was possible, to, I guess, get a testimony to, because it's a big setup going with an agency. You've got to set it all up, and then if it doesn't work, there's a lot of unpacking and starting again. So I would get as much as you could. But I do think other parents are gold. They're the ones that really know and can give the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Jo, it's wonderful having you here with
Oops.
us. So, so that's from Jo. She does talk a lot more when we had our actual conversation and the recording, and we hope we can share that with you, because there's some real gems in there of her learning alongside Dan. Leanne, I'm going to go to you now. And do you want to share your screen? Because you've got some slides. And we'd really just like to hear from your work what your thinking around working in partnership with providers looks like, and what are the key things we should be looking for.
Right, I do have a PowerPoint, so people can have something to take away, but I will share my screen now. Bear with me. Oops, sorry.
You're right.
So when you're asking about the principles of, you know, when working with a provider, some of the things that we've learned that works is based on just the regular stuff of the United Nations Convention of Persons with Disability. And that really comes back to those self-directed supports principles, which means people are experts in their own life. The people who love people are experts in their life, and people being guided, people being central in being guided around the service, choosing what responsibility they might want or need, and how that gets negotiated, and having full awareness of, you know, what funding or resources or supports that might be available. When thinking about partnerships with providers and getting the best out of it, there was a bit of work that we did a number of years ago in finding out from people with disability, their families, and service providers around the things that make it work really well. And some of those principles around providers really holding on to this idea that, you know, people have a right to be a citizen, and they have a right to live as they choose with the people of their choosing, whether that's in their own home like Dan, or other people that may choose to have a friend live with them, or a person that's not a friend but is looking to be a co-resident with them. Self-determination is another principle, like that element of acknowledging people's rights to self-determine. Having flexibility, ensuring that there's flexibility and a way to pivot and create and innovate. And importantly, the last three, which is around choice, mutual agreement from both parties. And as Margaret mentioned, trust. Like, we found trust to be the critical element of when you're in a partnership with a provider, for both parties to get the best out of that. And what we also learned was that in this, choice and control mantra that we've got with the NDIA, to be in control or to direct your own life or your support, it doesn't mean you have to do everything yourself. So part of what in partnership with a good provider is, and certainly what Jo's got with Dan and her provider, is about this, what is it that I feel that I can do, and what are the things that I might need support with to be able to live my life in the way in which it makes sense for me. So that partnership of trust, mutual respect, and agreed expectations becomes really critical, with a provider being willing to be led by the person and or their family, whether that's in words or action. So Dan was really clear, wanting to get out the car and move into his own place, or, that was in his actions, he was describing that. So it's willing to be led by that, willing to be led by people. And an agreement, when we're talking about an agreement with partnerships with providers, some people have talked to us about the partnership being formalized. So it's a bit like, again, Margaret was saying about, having an agreement, having an understanding around how is this going to work between us. And when we're looking at genuine partnerships, it is a willingness from organisations to uphold people's human and legal rights, be with people as partners, support people to be in control of their life as much as the person and or their family wants or needs. And I often talk about Stephen Covey's move at the speed of trust. And again, that fits in with what Margaret was talking about. It becomes absolutely critical, because we know the faster we do things, at times what we've seen is that trust can be eroded, and trust takes time. So you can only move at the speed of trust. And providers being willing to learn and reflect and change and pivot, as I said, and create and to do what they'll say they're going to do as a way of building that trust. And importantly, what we've seen is providers holding on to sometimes their organisational values and being torn between what the family or the cultural values are of that person, and which one trumps, right? Which one is the organisation willing to stand with? The other thing that, again, it taps into a little bit what Margaret was saying too, that a willingness from people and families to work in genuine partnership for trust to develop. And that can be tricky because people have been let down, and some people we know have found it easier to try and do it themselves, even though they don't want to, because they've been let down so badly. Families being really clear about expectations and outcomes that they want, and also understanding the legal and safeguarding requirements that if you're in partnership with a provider, they have to abide by. So I think the mutual benefit of understanding each other is where some of this is really important. When we're thinking about partnerships and what does it take to work, it's really ensuring that the provider and in partnership with the person is looking at the person from who they are, how they want to live, what's going to make sense to them, what support do they need, and then thinking about what out of this support does the person or the family want to be in control of, and what do they want the organisation to be in control of. And so feeding into some of what Margaret was talking about, that's where this fits. What is family business, what is service business, and what is shared business, and what can be negotiated. And then out of that partnership agreement comes, what will you do, what will I do, and what will we do together? So those expectations are set. some of those things that families have told us and providers actually have said, these are the things we need to make sure are clear between us. So how and who will decisions be made? Who will employ the support people? You know, how will they get paid? Who will be involved or do the actual recruiting and contracts? And who will supervise? Who will train? Who will coordinate? And there are many families who like to take on huge amounts of those tasks, but with the backup and the support of a provider if at any time it needs to change, which is where those emergency and backup arrangements become really important too. It also looks at thinking about what informal and formal safeguarding measures are in place. So again, family business, service business, and somewhere in between. So what are some of those that need to be worked through? If there's problems with the support people, who resolves it, who assists with it, and who and how will the person and or their family be supported by the organisation to be able to carry out the tasks that they might need some help to learn to start off with. People have told us, don't expect me to know all this right up front, but I'm dead keen to be involved in learning more about it so I can take more responsibility on. Other elements that get considered in this partnership is really those other sort of not nice things around what if something goes really wrong? How do we, you know, between us, and how do I terminate the agreement? How will the provider terminate? You know, who's making all these decisions? And what are our foundations? Usually trust in being able to work out those disagreements. When these types of more formal agreements and thinking needs to be utilised is where the provider and the person and or the family are in such a partnership that the provider is supporting the person to be the employer of the supports. So like Joe and Dan, Joe's the employer with Dan, and the provider, even though it's you know, a formalised arrangement, they provide support to Joe and Dan to be the best employer that they can. So any sort of decisions that get made, it's in partnership. So this is just, you know, this whole idea of a continuum of this partnership is I might do just one task as, you know, myself and a few of our waste team members will say, actually, I'm in partnership with a provider and I want them to do a lot of it. Actually, I want to do a few bits. Actually, I want to do a lot of the tasks. So I need a bit of help with that. So it's not one element or none or all. It's really that negotiation of what's going to work for you, what's going to work for me, and how can we ensure that expectations and outcomes are clear. Because what we know is when that works really well, the role of the organisation ultimately becomes to support the person to do it themselves. And when I say do it themselves, I'm not talking about taking full responsibility for all those tasks. It's about we're providing support to you to do it in the way in which it makes sense to you that also meets any legal or contractual requirements. So that criticality of the how that gets done is not doing to people. It's about that negotiation of what's reasonable and how do we work out our disagreements. So supporting people in a way that gives opportunity for learning, capacity building, making mistakes, and being there to help address anything that comes up. So these, I guess the partnerships that we've found really successful, and particularly when you're looking at people living in their own home, because it's very personal, there's lots of significant supports that get provided, that these expectations and trust is one of the key success factors, really. That's what we've found in hearing from people with disability, family members and service providers that have been in partnership with people for a very long time. That's me.
I'm just popping the link into choosing a service provider that that is Race Resource, a resource from WA Individualised Services. I'm just trying to find the chat. I want to ask both of you this question. Today we're primarily talking about individualised living arrangements. Why is it particularly important that we have a really good partnership with a provider? Marg, I'm going to ask you first. Why is it particularly important for individualised living arrangements that we have a good relationship with a provider when we're looking at these type of, a person living in their own home?
The first thing is, if you don't, the typical response is that the responsibilities of a service provider tend to encourage the service to take over the family business. So if the family is absent in a number of things, like they haven't got a vision or a plan, or they're not maintaining friendships, or they don't, they've walked away, is the worst example, then the service will take that over, and they will then create a life that may not be, and is likely not to be, what that person had envisioned for themselves. So I'm pretty harsh on families about this, as only another family member can and a service can't. But if you don't mark out your territory and name and fulfill your roles and responsibilities, a service will come in it's like, the slime under the door, and they will, for all the best reasons, but the person's life is quality of life is at risk. So, and I am quite clear on that. If when people are handed over to a service, to service world, they're done. They're done. They become part of the service world and all the displaced goals that services have. And we've seen this over and over and over, when people get subsumed into group homes, or they get, sent off to institutions, as the worst example, and families are either walk away for a whole lot of reasons. And often the reason is they can't get back in again. So that's why I think it's the NDIS has handed it to families on a plate and said, you can self-direct, you need to have a vision and plan. So it's now up to families to make the NDIS their own, find the service that's going to listen to them and work with them modestly and courteously, and then you're away. It's a work in progress, and it's also a skill. I say it's like sex, cooking, gardening. You get better over time at all of those things. And so you can't expect to be terrific at the beginning, but you can get better and better at it, about communicating, about working it out, doing the dance with the service. And if that service is just not going to dance with you, then you have the capacity now with the NDIS to pack up your bat and ball and go elsewhere. And we're seeing it in Queensland. There's a number of services that thought they were terrific and have had to close their doors because people have left. They've just gone. They're no longer sustainable. And, they have to look very hard at themselves about why that's happened. So it's you know, the other thing, I guess the other message in that is that the service you start with may not be the service you finish with. A bit like husbands, I don't know. I mean, but you know, you start off building a real, you know, a good life together and building the trust and all that and dancing away, and then things happen. So, you know, that's the blessing of the NDIS is that the family, the person with disability and families can move to someone else if it's no longer working. Amicable divorce, right? We're out of here, off we go. We'll find someone else to partner with. And I have no problem with that, because I just, you know, services have all sorts of pressures. They're rented strangers, you know, in your life. Personnel change all the time. So it's, you hope that someone will be stable over time, but that's not necessarily the case. It's likely not to be the case.
Thanks, Margaret. Leanne, have you got anything, your thoughts on that as well?
When you know, why is this important around this partnership? And you know, when things are going really well and you're developing a partnership and it's going pretty well and it's all established and you're clear, and people are clear about their roles and the tasks that they're doing and the staff are clear, then, you know, what we've seen is when families have got ill, or a family member has passed away, and say dad's passed away and mum's needing to be elsewhere, and it means that when a provider can step in because they're aware of their, not only their moral responsibilities but their legal responsibilities in providing support, it's clear around these emergency and backup plans. And or if someone happens to, you know, if they're in a rental and the rental property, you know, is getting sold, you know, people can be homeless. And, you know, for certainly with some of the older families that we've supported, you know, that's been really tricky for some people. So having a partnership where everything's clear and they're willing to step in can be a really great safeguard.
Yeah, can I just comment on that? I agree that it's good to have a service that knows you so well they can step in for the short term.
Yes.
It's when families have not done their family business, and that includes their succession plan. Who's going to do this when I'm getting old and crabby and frail? If you haven't done that work, then the service will be obliged to step in right into the middle of family business and take it over. Now that's dangerous, and I see this happening. So that's why alongside this conversation, we should be having the one with families about succession planning.
Mm-hmm.
Who is going to step up and do this work, do this leading, do this vision building? Who's going to do the family business? And we've all talked ad nauseam about this, and it's tricky, it's difficult, but it needs to be done. In fact, I think it needs to be done through 3 generations. So there's mum and dad, then there's the siblings and cousins and friends, and then it's their children who'll be looking out for this person and safeguarding the family customs and rituals and vision when that person is old and frail. So it's a 3-generational thing, and it should be being done all the time. So when someone throws a shoe, you know, like mum has a stroke, she's been doing this for years, she has a stroke, it's the next generation is stepping up, has already stepped up. So, and we, you know, I get very nervous when services feel they've got to take over that stuff in the absence of anyone doing the family business.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's a really important point. And quite a few of the people over the years that certainly we've been supported in setting up their own individualised living arrangement some have had only paid support in their life, and navigating that with a provider and ensuring that, you know, roles are clear and expectations are clear, and how to build more social capital in someone's world becomes really important, because quite a few people that have moved out of institutions or out of group homes that wanted a more individualized living arrangement didn't, you know, haven't got and haven't had family in their life for a very long time. So a really, you know, some people rely on a provider to step in, and a really good partnership can be a very good safeguard in those circumstances, whilst over time social capital can be built with the person.
Well, as long as that social capital is being built, someone's out there hunting for friends and family, dragging them in and getting them to do their work. I hear too often services say, but there's nobody in their life. It's an excuse for the work not being done. It's an excuse, and I don't like it. So that work must be done right from the beginning. As soon as that person comes into your service, you know, that you're hunting for those freely given relationships and encouraging them to take up family business.
Leanne, I've heard you say, I'm just going to paraphrase it and probably get it all wrong, but what can we do to bring one more person into your life? And what can we do to bring one person who's on your outer circle closer in? That's some of your work?
That's the mantra.
Yeah.
That's the mantra. It's like, this is our work. How do we bring more people in? Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, and I think that for just reflecting, Margaret, Jacob has a circle of support around him, and his nephews are now of the age to join. So not his nephews, his cousins are now of the age to join his circle of support. So I sort of feel like we're bringing in the second generation. We've brought in the second generation with people around the same age as Jacob. His nephews are a good 10 years younger, so it's probably half a generation again. To bring in and really had that key role in Jacob's life going forward. I'm gonna ask, well, maybe we should go to the Q&A. I can see there's quite a few questions. Karen, did you want to pull out some of the questions, or should I ask Marg and Leanne another question?
No, we can do a couple from the audience. I think, yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I'll go to the last one first. Is what about when the person with disability wants to live alone, but the NDIS funds only fund a group living situation, and how to navigate that?
I think this is a really interesting question, Margaret, because you found very creative ways of supporting Mina to live in her own home when there wasn't enough funding. And you heard Joe also say that they had to be really creative as well. And the idea of housemates was one of those ideas. But and Leanne, have you got some thoughts there?
Margaret, did you want to go?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, once the NDIS decides how you're going to live and where you're going to live, you're done. It's the family, the person with the disability and their families make that decision. And maybe the NDIS doesn't agree with you, but you use the NDIS as best the money. That's all it is. It's money, as best you can, and get creative. I get worried when I hear families saying, "Oh, well, we have to, you know, go into a share house." Well, no, you don't. You don't have to, but you got to do some work on that and find out what other families have done. And you know, Joe Nunn, you know, say, you know, this the knowledge is in other families. so I'm not saying it's easy. Nothing's easy in this game. Put that aside. But it has been done and it will continue to be done. And it will require that family with the person to be very clear of that vision, because there will be all sorts of easy, slippery, slidey ways to get, a solution, a fast solution, when the best solution is much harder to do. So yeah, it's just hard work and it's creative work, but it can be done.
Leanne, have you got some thoughts?
Look, I think, agreeing with what Margaret said in terms of like, this is all really tricky work, and funding and supports obviously become pretty critical to people, but life is much bigger than a service too. So how are we, the NDIS has become this, as John O'Brien, a very great mentor, was saying, he's from the US, but he knows the NDIS stuff very well. And he'd say, that NDIS has become this magnet that is drawing us all to, it's this magnet that's just attracting us around how much money have I got? How can I spend it? And that's all real and genuine, right? But there's also this other stuff, like when I say social capital, what I'm talking about is, people who love me and who I can love, and I can be there for them and they can be there for me. And that's larger than a service. And I think that also forms part of a design of how people want to live, becomes really important, not just about the funding, but I'm not disregarding the importance of some people to have fairly critical support needs met either.
It's really tricky. Sorry, it is a tricky component of the NDIS in determining that, funding based on sharing supports. And I just think that, start looking, I think it's almost like start creatively and then work out, how you can make the money work. Sorry, Margaret, I'll let you go.
This game's about mischief. If families kowtow to the government and to the service world, and what they think the limits are, then it just limits your creativity. I'm a great believer in being mischievous, getting a bottle of wine in front of the fire and doing a bit of mischief making, thinking, how can this happen? Let's think outside the box. Let's stop worrying about Bruce Bonner Haiti and the review. And really, we've got, one short time on this earth, and we're going to make it the best. Now, this is a bucket of money. It mightn't be exactly what we want, but by God, we're going to make this happen. And when you've got that can-do attitude, and you get some other mischievous people with you, then you're firing. But if you let those droopy drawers come in and tell you what's not possible, then just waste your time. Slam the door in their face. Only let those can-doers in the door and get going. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another one that question that is along those lines as well. I think we've probably covered it. I'm just going to make sure the person's question's asked though, but it's again that systems and working with the systems, which is why we knew having right relationship with service was so important, right, to deliver. So this question was about being told by the service provider that they can't do these sorts of innovative things due to the requirements, for instance, of the NDIS.
Well, you sack them.
And having good examples of service was part of that as well. So yeah, how do you have good examples of good services, which is the right relationship? And it can be an individual relationship that doesn't work for one person with that service, but does for another as well. Is that a fair comment that you would want to respond to?
So Leanne, I've taken a lot of airtime.
That's fine. I guess in relation to, you know, finding a service provider and yes, there are compliance things that providers have to do, but certainly providers that I know of and are offering these sort of shared partnerships arrangements and still meeting their audits and still actually getting, you know, if any non-conformities at all. So, you know, there are examples, and I think the more that we can connect people to those good examples, and for providers to know the how to, right? There are some providers that I've connected with over the years. Obviously, you know, the work that I've been doing hasn't been as a service provider. It's been as a, you know, funded service by our state to support people to think about this and to support providers in offering more flexible and creative arrangements. So what we've heard from some providers is this is really tricky for us, and help us to know more about it, because if all we're going on is what we've known before, then how do we start to do things differently within our culture, within our focus, within our systems, within our finances? Like, we want to do something differently, but how are we also learning about how to do stuff and be led by people? And that's been a definite barrier for some providers, but there are providers who are offering these types of partnerships and willingness to be led by the person and working out what that family business, service business and joint business might be. Just a lot of them are in WA.
In answer to the question of where do you find the service, in 1990, we couldn't find a service, so we set one up. Now, and it was a group of 10 families, and we said we didn't know it at the time, but we're going to do the NDIS. So we brought the money into the service and then gave the families the authority to manage their own budgets. So I don't suggest you go off and set up your own service, but you may find a small group of families who will work with you. And I've seen that happen, 3 or 4 families that'll work together. And pool some of their resources to do the service business and the shared business. So there's material around on different ways that service can be provided beyond the formal service system. Speaking out of turn here because I'm out of date, but let me say these 10 families in 1990 could not find anything, so they set it up themselves. That's how determined they were that that right relationship was important, that the honouring family business and service business and working together was so important that they set it up themselves.
And I think we see that a lot of people, as Leanne mentioned as well, and I have to say I'm included there with my son, have created essentially a service for one using NDIS funding, because there aren't a lot of services who are doing this. And Melissa's just asked if that was Life Without Barriers and in the service that was set up. And I don't think it was, Margaret, it was Homes West.
No, it was Homes West. Homes West.
Yes. And Life Without Barriers has become one of the biggest group home providers in Australia. So I suspect that's not the legacy that you were hoping for.
No.
Leanne, have you got some thoughts about, sorry, Margaret.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to add on that Homes West closed down when the NDIS came in because the families were so adept at managing their budgets and all that. They just went on and did it themselves. So we actually didn't need that mechanism, because Homes West had taught them how to do it they were ahead of the game. It's not as simple as that, but that's one of the reasons why Homes West closed down.
I'm going to just ask Leanne and you both for your top 5 tips for
Oh.
finding a provider. So quick dot points here because we've got to wrap it up in a few minutes.
Oh. Okay, we go 1, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah, that would be great. Excellent.
Well, at the risk of sounding boring, be very clear on your family business, and when you go into any agreement or any involvement with a service. That's my first one. Leanne?
Find other people and family members to connect with that say this service is doing stuff really well with me. And if you don't have people that you connected with, see if you can connect with one of the NACBO, the NACBO organisations like Belonging Matters, and there's, you know, they're all over Australia to
Yes.
connect with, because they have,
communities.
yep, resourcing inclusive, because they've got a lot of connections with providers in each state, not providers, with people and families in each state and peer groups that could help.
Fantastic.
Okay, be kind to yourself as families around trust. You're likely to have been betrayed at some point along the journey, and it will take you time and effort to build trust, and but it's worth the effort.
Leanne?
Be discerning, ask lots of questions. Don't hesitate to ask specifically, will you help me to be the employer with you, with my staff? Will you assist me in setting myself up as that? Will you assist me with keeping informed about my expenditure? Or would you help me build my capacity to self-manage at one time? So just ask lots of questions and be discerning, and yeah.
Fantastic. Margaret?
So, okay. Remember that a service is the service people are rented strangers. It sounds a little harsh, but they all come from very different backgrounds. So the things that are important to you that you may take for granted, you may need to explain. So from how you'd like the phone answered to how you like the bathroom cleaned or the towels folded, those things, when someone who doesn't know come into your house and do it a different way, can drive you nuts. So it's part of that sharing information, maybe right down to your soap holder or how you want the fridge stacked. It's as important as that to build that relationship, or those things can eat away at you.
One more from Leanne and then we'll have to wrap it up.
When I mix up the last two that I just said, so join them together and ask the provider that you might be interviewing or talking to, can I talk with some of the people that you support? And if you offer really flexible and creative arrangements, can I talk to them? Because sometimes, you know, what people might think they're being offered isn't what's actually being offered. So just feel within your rights to say, I'd really like to talk to some family members, and, you know, good providers will have other family members that would be willing to chat with other families.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. And I'm going to say thank you to Jo, even though she wasn't here, and Dan as well. I'm going to wrap us in just now. We could talk for another hour, I think. But it's been wonderful hearing from both of you and your experience in the sector, and really kind of getting a great idea of you know, what we should be doing as families. I'm going to just say to everybody, if you're in New South Wales, you can call us. We can talk to you more about individualised living. It's going to be me. So you can call me. There's some email addresses there. We'll send this out to you as well in a follow-up email. I hope you've completed the poll as well. And if you're not in New South Wales, these are the other NACBO organisations. So this is a way of connecting with other families. and finding out about what other families are doing. So if you're in Queensland, it's CRU, Community Resource Unit. If you're in Victoria or Tasmania, it's Belonging Matters. WA is Valued Lives. Imagine More in the ACT, and in South Australia, it's Purple Orange. Big thank you to all of you for joining us today. Some really good questions. We'll have a look at the questions as well that weren't answered today, and we'll see if we can follow up in an email with some answers to those questions. So Leanne and Margaret, I hope you don't mind if I bother you with a few more questions after this. And thank you very much for both of you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. And I think we'll end the session.
I was just leaving the poll up for just a tick longer.
Okay, we'll leave the poll up.
Means can't finish the session. We're nearly there. Okay. All right, call it now then, Linda.
Okay, we'll see you all
Bye.
later. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Do you want to have have you got the link to meet again, Leanne and Mark?
Yes.
Great, see you shortly.
Sorry, is it by email?
In your in the chat. In
Oh,
directly to you,
okay.
Leanne.
Okay, hold on.
I can send it to you in an email.
That's all right. I've got it.
Okay, great. See you shortly. Oh, I've got to get it too.
I gave it to you as well.
I know, I just can't find it.
In the chat.
See you. Bye, everybody.